The rain began before the bells, a fine silver drizzle that softened the edges of London's narrow streets and pressed the scent of wet stone against the high windows of St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, where candles had already been lit in patient rows and white roses trembled beneath their own fragile perfection, awaiting a bride whose name society had repeated all morning with equal parts admiration and speculation. Miss Eliza Whitcombe stood at the threshold of the nave with her gloved hands folded carefully at her waist, as though composure itself were a garment she must not allow to wrinkle, and though the ivory silk of her gown whispered with every breath she drew, she did not permit herself to turn toward the restless murmur behind her, for she understood that the moment she looked at them, at the assembled witnesses of her ascent, she would feel the weight of their expectations settle upon her shoulders like snow. Her mother's trembling fingers brushed her sleeve only once, a fleeting touch that carried more fear than blessing, and Eliza answered it with a steady smile that seemed, even to herself, like something she had borrowed from a stronger woman, for she had promised both of them that this morning would restore their place among those who measured worth not by kindness but by alliances, and she meant to keep that promise with dignity if not with ease. The cathedral doors opened wider, the music began its slow ascent beneath the vaulted ceiling, and she stepped forward into the aisle as every whisper turned toward her at once, their curiosity blooming like a sudden storm of wings. Guests leaned together beneath jeweled hats and polished expressions, remarking upon the delicacy of her veil, the modesty of her dowry, the remarkable fortune of her match, and though each comment floated lightly enough to pass for admiration, Eliza felt their sharper meanings grazing her confidence with quiet insistence, as if reminding her that admiration could change its shape at any moment without warning. Yet she continued forward with measured grace, holding her head high beneath the soft glow of candlelight, until she reached the place where the man who was to become her husband stood waiting beneath an arch of white blossoms that had been arranged to resemble innocence itself. Mr. Frederick Halvern did not smile when she approached him, though he had smiled often enough during their engagement to persuade her mother that his reserve concealed only seriousness rather than uncertainty, and as Eliza lifted her eyes to his face she perceived, with a strange stillness that seemed to silence even the rain beyond the windows, that his expression contained something colder than hesitation. The officiant began his solemn words, inviting the witnesses to observe the union that would bind their futures together, and Eliza listened carefully for the familiar cadence of expectation in Frederick's voice when his turn came to answer, yet what emerged instead was a pause so deliberate that it seemed almost theatrical. "I cannot proceed," he said at last, his voice clear enough to reach even the farthest pews, and the words fell into the cathedral with a weight that no one immediately understood, for they hovered there like an unfamiliar echo searching for meaning before striking the hearts of those who heard them. Eliza felt her breath hesitate inside her chest, not with shock but with a sudden, bewildering clarity, as though the future she had rehearsed for months had quietly stepped aside and revealed a stranger standing in its place. Frederick turned toward the gathered guests rather than toward her, and his composure sharpened visibly beneath their attention, lending him a confidence that had never appeared so strongly in private conversation. "It would be dishonest," he continued, "to bind myself to a lady whose circumstances render such a union imprudent, for sentiment cannot substitute for advantage, and affection alone cannot justify elevation." The murmurs began at once, first as faint ripples of disbelief, then as unmistakable currents of speculation moving through the cathedral with the swift efficiency of gossip that had long been waiting for permission to exist. And Eliza understood with painful precision that her worth had just been weighed aloud before an audience that would remember every syllable long after the candles burned low. Her mother's breath caught sharply somewhere behind her, yet Eliza did not turn, because she knew that if she looked backward she might never again manage to face forward with steadiness. "I regret any misunderstanding," Frederick added with careful politeness, though his eyes did not meet hers, "but I cannot marry where there is nothing to secure the future of my name." For a single fragile moment the bouquet slipped from Eliza's fingers and rested against the marble floor at her feet like a fallen promise, and though several guests leaned forward as if expecting tears, she discovered instead that a curious calm had settled around her heart, enclosing her humiliation inside a silence that felt almost protective. She bent to retrieve the flowers with deliberate grace, straightened her shoulders beneath the scrutiny of every eye, and lifted her gaze toward the altar as though the ceremony itself had not been interrupted but merely transformed into something she must now endure with quiet courage. "My daughter deserves better than whispers," her mother said faintly from the pews, yet the words dissolved into the growing tide of speculation before they could gather strength enough to defend her. It was then that a voice from the rear of the cathedral spoke with such measured authority that the murmuring ceased as if commanded by an invisible hand, and though Eliza had not yet turned to see the speaker, she sensed immediately that something unexpected had entered the fragile space surrounding her dignity. If society abandons a lady in her hour of trial, the stranger said calmly, it forfeits its privilege to judge her. The guests parted instinctively to allow him forward, their curiosity reshaping itself into astonishment as they recognized the tall figure advancing beneath the dim glow of the chandeliers, and Eliza felt the strange certainty that the future which had just been taken from her was already being replaced by something she could not yet name. He stopped beside her without hesitation, inclined his head with quiet respect, and offered his arm as though such gestures were the most natural response to cruelty in a crowded cathedral. "Miss Whitcombe," he said gently, "London has watched enough." And only then did the whispers begin again, louder now with disbelief, because the man who had spoken those words was a duke none of them expected to see at her side. The rain had not ceased when the duke's carriage carried Miss Eliza Whitcombe away from the cathedral steps, yet the sound of it striking the lacquered roof above her seemed no longer accusatory but strangely protective, as though the city itself were attempting to veil her departure from the eyes that had watched her humiliation with such attentive curiosity only moments before. She sat opposite the man who had altered the course of her morning with a single sentence, her gloved hands folded once more in her lap with deliberate composure, though she could not entirely quiet the trembling awareness that she had accepted assistance from a gentleman whose motives remained as mysterious as his sudden appearance. He did not question her silence, nor did he attempt conversation with the restless urgency of one eager to justify an impulsive decision, but instead regarded the passing streets with a calm attentiveness that suggested he understood the importance of allowing dignity to recover before demanding explanation. At last he spoke, not as though he were rescuing her but as though he were acknowledging a simple truth already known to them both. "You have been treated unjustly, Miss Whitcombe," he said quietly, "and injustice should never be left unattended where it can still be corrected." Eliza lifted her gaze to meet his for the first time since they had entered the carriage together, and though she expected curiosity or calculation she discovered instead an expression marked by restraint so deliberate that it resembled courtesy rather than scrutiny. "Your Grace has already done more than kindness requires," she replied, her voice steady despite the lingering echo of the cathedral's whispers. "I fear London will consider your intervention an imprudence." "London considers many things," he answered with a faint suggestion of amusement, "but it does not command my judgment." The carriage slowed before a pair of wrought-iron gates that opened without hesitation to admit them into a sweeping avenue bordered by winter roses still holding stubborn traces of bloom despite the season's reluctance to spare them, and Eliza felt her breath catch softly as she realized she had been brought not to some discreet lodging arranged for temporary refuge but to the Duke's own residence, whose broad facade rose beyond the trees with the quiet confidence of inheritance that had never once been questioned. Servants appeared before the carriage had fully halted, their expressions respectful but not surprised, as though they had been expecting her arrival long before she herself understood that she would be welcomed there. The Duke descended first and offered his hand without ceremony, assisting her from the carriage with the same measured courtesy he might have shown a duchess rather than a lady whose name was already being reshaped by gossip in drawing-rooms across the city. "This house is at your disposal for as long as you require peace," he said simply, guiding her across the threshold where candlelight softened the marble floors and muted the echo of her footsteps. "No explanation will be requested of you here." She paused beneath the high ceiling of the entrance hall, astonished less by the grandeur surrounding her than by the absence of curiosity in the servants' manner, for not one of them allowed even a glance of speculation to disturb the calm efficiency with which they relieved her of her damp cloak and conducted her toward a quiet chamber overlooking the rose gardens. "You extend generosity beyond reason, Your Grace," she said at last when they stood alone beside the tall windows through which the rain could still be seen tracing silver paths across the glass. "I cannot imagine what obligation persuades you to offer it." He regarded her for a moment with an expression that suggested he weighed his answer carefully before allowing it to emerge. "Not obligation," he replied. "Recognition." The word lingered between them with a gravity that demanded explanation. Yet before she could speak again he reached into his coat and placed a small silver key in her palm with a gentleness that seemed almost ceremonial in its restraint. "My library is seldom open to visitors," he said, watching her close her fingers around it as though he were entrusting her with something more significant than access to books. "But I believe you will find it a companion rather than a refuge." Eliza studied the key with quiet astonishment, for she understood at once that such an offering implied confidence far greater than courtesy alone could justify, and she felt the first faint stirring of curiosity stronger than humiliation begin to take shape within her thoughts. Before she could inquire further, however, the stillness of the chamber was interrupted by the distant sound of carriage wheels arriving beyond the courtyard gates, followed quickly by the discreet approach of a footman bearing a folded note whose seal bore the unmistakable crest of the very household that had rejected her only hours earlier. The Duke accepted the message without visible surprise and broke the seal with calm deliberation, his expression remaining unchanged as he read the brief contents before handing the paper to her with quiet composure. "They request the return of the engagement ring," he said simply. Eliza regarded the words written in Frederick Halvern's careful hand, noting the absence of apology as clearly as the presence of instruction, and though the request might once have wounded her deeply, she discovered instead that it seemed strangely insignificant compared to the unexpected steadiness she now felt standing within the Duke's quiet protection. "I shall return it," she said at last, removing the ring from her glove with deliberate calm before placing it upon the table beside her without hesitation, as though relinquishing it required no sacrifice she had not already made beneath the cathedral's vaulted ceiling. The Duke inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her decision with a respect that suggested he recognized the courage concealed within its simplicity, and for a moment neither of them spoke as the rain continued its patient rhythm beyond the windows. Then, with the faintest trace of warmth entering his voice for the first time since they had met, he said, "London will speak of this morning for many weeks." Eliza lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a composure she had not possessed when the bells first rang at St. Bartholomew's. "Let it speak," she answered quietly. His expression softened almost imperceptibly, as though her answer had confirmed something he had long suspected but never before heard spoken aloud. "Yes," he said at last, his voice carrying a quiet certainty that altered the air between them. "It shall." The storm announced itself long before the first thunder reached the windows of the Duke's estate, gathering instead as a slow darkening of the afternoon sky that pressed the rose gardens into shadow and turned the distant trees into silhouettes trembling beneath the weight of approaching rain, and Eliza Whitcombe watched its progress from the tall library window with the silver key still warm in her memory, aware that the quiet refuge she had accepted within these walls was beginning to feel less like shelter and more like a threshold she did not yet understand how to cross. The library itself bore the unmistakable character of a man who preferred truth to ornament, its shelves rising toward the ceiling in solemn ranks of leather-bound volumes that seemed to hold the silence of many generations within their careful order. And though Eliza had spent several hours wandering among them with the respectful curiosity of one who recognized both privilege and responsibility in her presence there, she could not entirely ignore the growing sense that she had been invited, not merely to read but to be seen. Outside, the first rain struck the glass with sudden determination, and she turned at once as the door opened behind her without ceremony, admitting the Duke with a composure that matched the steadiness of the storm rather than the urgency of interruption. "I feared the weather might persuade you to abandon the gardens," he said quietly, though his gaze suggested he had known precisely where she would be. "I discovered they had already persuaded me," she replied with a faint smile that surprised even herself, for it carried none of the careful restraint she had worn so faithfully in the days since her humiliation. He crossed the room slowly, as though unwilling to disturb the fragile peace that had settled there, and paused beside the long table where she had left several open volumes whose subjects revealed little except her preference for histories that recorded kindness as faithfully as ambition. "You read as though you are searching," he observed gently. "Perhaps I am," she answered, meeting his eyes with a steadiness she could not have imagined possessing beneath the cathedral's chandeliers. It is difficult to understand why one's life changes so quickly without explanation. For a moment he did not reply, and the silence between them filled instead with the quiet insistence of rain against the windows, until at last he spoke with a gravity that suggested he had delayed this answer not from reluctance but from respect. "Then you must allow me to correct that omission," he said. Eliza felt her breath pause as he reached toward the small writing desk near the window and opened a narrow drawer with deliberate calm, withdrawing from it a miniature portrait whose frame bore the softened edges of something long handled and carefully preserved. He placed it before her without comment. At first she did not recognize the likeness, for the face within the delicate oval painting was younger than the woman she now knew herself to be, its expression unguarded in a way she scarcely remembered permitting even in private. Yet as she looked more closely she understood with sudden certainty that she was studying not a stranger but her own reflection captured years earlier by an observer she had never suspected. "You cannot mean," she began softly. "I do," he replied with quiet simplicity. She lifted the portrait carefully, aware that her hands trembled not from uncertainty but from the astonishing realization that her presence in this house had not been the consequence of impulse but of memory. "I saw you once before," he continued, his voice steady despite the intimacy of the confession. "You were standing beside the stables at your uncle's estate, speaking to a boy whose injury had been ignored by those who believed him unimportant. Eliza remembered the afternoon at once, not because she had considered it remarkable but because she had never imagined anyone had witnessed it. "He had fallen from a ladder," she said slowly. "No one wished to delay the guest's arrival by attending to him." "You did," the Duke answered. "You knelt in the dust without hesitation." The simplicity of his words carried more weight than praise could have done, and Eliza felt the strange and unfamiliar sensation of being known not for her appearance or her prospects but for a kindness she had never intended to display before an audience. "I did only what anyone ought to have done," she said quietly. "No," he replied with unmistakable conviction. "You did what almost no one present chose to do." Thunder rolled across the sky with sudden authority, and for a moment neither of them spoke as the rain intensified against the windows, sealing the room within a silence that felt less like isolation and more like recognition. "I remembered that moment," he continued at last, his voice softened by something she could not yet name. "When your engagement was announced, I intended to remain silent, because honor demanded it." "And when it ended?" she asked, though she already sensed the answer. "Then silence became impossible." The truth of his words altered something deep within her understanding, shifting her sense of herself from abandoned bride to chosen companion in a way that left her both humbled and unsettled by the responsibility it implied. "You intervened because you remembered me," she said slowly. "I intervened because I never forgot you," he answered. The certainty in his voice left no space for doubt, and Eliza felt the fragile structure of her assumptions begin to rearrange itself around a possibility she had not dared consider when she first accepted his arm beneath the cathedral's shadowed ceiling. Before she could reply, however, another sound reached them through the storm's steady rhythm, the unmistakable arrival of carriage wheels in the courtyard below, followed by the hurried approach of footsteps in the corridor beyond the library door that carried with them an urgency no servant would have permitted without cause. The Duke turned slightly toward the interruption, his expression sharpening with attentive concern rather than annoyance, and when the door opened to admit a footman bearing a sealed envelope marked with the crimson crest of Lady Harcourt's household, Eliza recognized at once that whatever peace had begun to grow between them was about to be tested by the very society that had already judged her once before. "She has requested your presence at her ball tomorrow evening," the Duke said after reading the message, his voice calm though his eyes remained fixed upon hers with unusual intensity. Eliza felt the weight of the invitation settle over her like the first echo of another storm, because Lady Harcourt's gatherings were never merely celebrations but stages upon which reputations were quietly reshaped. "And she has added," he continued after a brief pause, "that Mr. Frederick Halvern intends to attend." The evening of Lady Harcourt's ball arrived beneath a sky polished to a cold brilliance that seemed determined to remind London that winter had not yet surrendered its authority, and the long sweep of carriages approaching her illuminated residence formed a glittering procession of expectation in which every arrival carried the faint promise of spectacle, though none among the assembled guests suspected how completely the balance of reputation would shift before the night had ended. Eliza Whitcombe stood before the tall mirror in the Duke's carriage house chamber reserved for her preparation, studying the unfamiliar confidence reflected in her posture as though she were meeting a woman she had once admired from a distance but never expected to resemble. Her gown was not the bridal ivory that had witnessed her humiliation but a deep shade of midnight blue that gathered the candlelight into quiet strength rather than fragile brightness, and at her throat rested a modest diamond clasp whose simplicity revealed more taste than display, a deliberate choice that suggested dignity restored rather than fortune acquired. When the Duke entered to escort her, he paused for the briefest instant upon the threshold as though acknowledging not merely her appearance but the transformation it represented, and the silence between them carried a gravity that required no compliment to make itself understood. "You are prepared," he said at last, offering his arm with the calm assurance that had first steadied her beneath the cathedral's shadowed arches. "I am resolved," she answered, and he inclined his head slightly as though the distinction pleased him. The carriage journey to Lady Harcourt's residence passed with a quiet composure that concealed the magnitude of what awaited them, yet Eliza sensed in the Duke's stillness beside her not hesitation but readiness, as though he had long anticipated this confrontation and intended to meet it not as a spectacle but as a correction. When the carriage finally halted before the entrance, the blaze of lanterns along the marble steps revealed a gathering already alive with expectation, for word of her attendance had traveled faster than discretion and curiosity had drawn nearly every notable figure in London's social orbit to witness her return. The moment she entered the ballroom upon the Duke's arm, conversation faltered with such sudden unanimity that the silence itself seemed to acknowledge her presence more eloquently than applause could have done, and though dozens of eyes examined her with undisguised fascination, none carried the careless pity that had followed her departure from St. Bartholomew's Cathedral only days earlier. Instead she felt something far more powerful replacing it: uncertainty. Lady Harcourt herself approached with elaborate warmth that could not entirely conceal the keen satisfaction she took in orchestrating such a gathering, her jeweled fan moving with delicate precision as she extended her welcome in tones carefully pitched to reach every nearby listener. "Miss Whitcombe," she said brightly, "London has awaited your return with the keenest interest." "I should be sorry to disappoint it," Eliza replied, her composure so effortless that even Lady Harcourt's practiced smile faltered briefly beneath its calm assurance. The music resumed as though released from restraint, yet the attention of the room remained fixed upon her progress across the polished floor beside the Duke, whose quiet authority transformed each step into something approaching a declaration long before he spoke a single word. Eliza felt the weight of expectation gather once more around her shoulders, but this time it no longer pressed her downward. Instead it seemed to lift her forward toward a moment she understood must arrive before the evening ended. That moment came sooner than she expected. Frederick Halvern approached with a confidence that appeared carefully constructed rather than genuine, his expression arranged in the familiar politeness that had once persuaded her mother to trust his intentions, yet which now revealed itself as something far thinner when measured against the steadiness of the Duke's silent presence at her side. He bowed with precise courtesy, though the gesture carried a hesitation that betrayed his uncertainty before the assembled witnesses. "Miss Whitcombe," he began, his voice low enough to suggest privacy yet unmistakably audible to those nearest them, "I fear our last meeting occurred under circumstances that neither of us desired." Eliza regarded him calmly, aware that the entire ballroom seemed to lean closer in anticipation of her reply. "Circumstances," she answered, "are rarely accidental, Mr. Halvern." A faint flush touched his face, and he glanced briefly toward the Duke before continuing with renewed determination. "I have reflected upon my conduct with considerable regret," he said carefully. "It would please me greatly if we might speak together with less formality than the present company permits." Before Eliza could respond, the Duke stepped forward with a composure so measured that it commanded attention more effectively than any raised voice could have done, his presence altering the atmosphere around them with unmistakable finality. "I believe Miss Whitcombe has already been subjected to sufficient public conversation," he said quietly, his words carrying across the nearby circle of listeners with the unmistakable clarity of authority. "Any further discussion concerning her comfort shall take place only with her consent." Frederick's expression tightened, though he attempted to recover his confidence with a faint smile that convinced no one who observed it closely. "Your Grace misinterprets my intentions," he said. "I seldom do," the Duke replied. A ripple of astonishment moved through the room, for such directness rarely appeared in conversation conducted beneath Lady Harcourt's chandeliers, and Eliza felt the remarkable certainty that the moment she had once feared was now unfolding not as humiliation but as vindication. Frederick's composure faltered at last. "Miss Whitcombe," he said with sudden urgency, "you must understand that my decision was influenced by considerations beyond my personal preference." "I understand perfectly," she answered, her voice steady enough to carry beyond the immediate circle of listeners. "You preferred advantage to loyalty." The clarity of her words struck the room with unmistakable force, and for a moment no one spoke as the truth she had pronounced settled into the silence like a verdict. The Duke regarded her with unmistakable approval before reaching quietly into his coat and removing a ring whose dark engraving marked it as unmistakably his own, its design bearing the history of generations who had worn it before him. "This has belonged to my family for more than a century," he said, placing it gently in her hand while every eye in the ballroom fixed itself upon the gesture. "I offer it not as obligation but as trust, until such time as you choose your future without interference from anyone who once doubted your worth." The room seemed to draw breath at once, astonishment giving way to recognition as the meaning of his action became unmistakable, and Eliza felt the weight of the ring settle into her palm with a significance far greater than ornament. Before she could speak, however, Lady Harcourt herself stepped forward with a smile sharpened by triumph. "How fortunate," she said softly, ensuring her voice carried just far enough to be heard. "For I understand His Grace intends to make a further announcement before the evening ends." The murmur that followed Lady Harcourt's carefully measured remark did not fade as ordinary curiosity might have done, but instead gathered strength with each passing moment until the ballroom itself seemed suspended between expectation and revelation. Eliza Whitcombe felt the subtle tightening of the Duke's arm beneath her fingers as though he understood that the evening had reached the precise point at which silence would become more dangerous than truth. She did not immediately look at him, for she sensed that whatever he intended to declare must be spoken before witnesses rather than exchanged in private assurance, and so she allowed the weight of the assembled company's attention to settle upon her without retreating from it, discovering with quiet astonishment that she no longer feared their scrutiny as she once had beneath the cathedral's unforgiving arches. Lady Harcourt's smile lingered with deliberate brightness, her jeweled fan moving slowly against her palm as though she were conducting the pace of the moment itself, and the surrounding guests instinctively formed a wider circle that left Eliza and the Duke standing within a space that resembled a stage more than a gathering. Frederick Halvern remained only a few steps away, his expression fixed in a polite stillness that concealed neither his discomfort nor his uncertainty, and Eliza recognized with calm clarity that the future he had attempted to deny her was now being rewritten before his eyes. The Duke released her hand only long enough to step forward where every listener could see him clearly, his posture unhurried yet unmistakably resolved, and when he spoke his voice carried with it the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without raising it. "I had not intended to speak tonight," he began, "because I believed Miss Whitcombe deserved time to choose her path free from pressure or spectacle, yet it has become evident that silence encourages misunderstandings which no gentleman should permit to stand uncorrected." A hush spread outward from him like the widening circle formed by a stone dropped into still water, and Eliza felt the extraordinary steadiness of his presence reach her even before he turned toward her again. "I have known Miss Whitcombe's character far longer than society imagines," he continued, his gaze resting upon her with a warmth that required no ornament. "Her kindness was evident to me years before any engagement was announced in her name, and my regard for her did not begin in sympathy but in admiration." The simplicity of his confession altered the atmosphere of the ballroom more powerfully than any dramatic declaration could have done, for it replaced speculation with certainty and transformed curiosity into respect. Eliza felt her breath catch as the truth he offered restored not only her reputation but her history, returning to her a dignity she had not realized could be publicly reclaimed. "I remained silent when she was promised elsewhere," he went on, "because honor demanded restraint where her happiness appeared secure, yet when she was publicly wronged I discovered that restraint could no longer be mistaken for courtesy." A quiet stir moved through the gathered listeners, not of scandal but of recognition, and Eliza became aware that the judgment once directed against her had shifted entirely toward the man who now stood uncomfortably within its reach. Frederick attempted to speak, though his voice lacked the confidence it had once carried. "Your Grace exaggerates the nature of what occurred," he said carefully. "My decision was made with practical considerations in mind." "Practical considerations," the Duke repeated with measured calm, "rarely require a lady's humiliation to justify them." The clarity of his answer left no space for further argument, and Frederick's composure faltered visibly as several nearby guests turned their attention toward him with expressions that no longer concealed their disapproval. Eliza stepped forward then, not because she required defense but because she recognized that the moment demanded her own voice as surely as it had required the Duke's. She met Frederick's gaze with steady composure and spoke with a gentleness that carried unmistakable strength. "You have already explained yourself sufficiently, Mr. Halvern," she said. "What remains to be understood concerns not your decision but my future." The quiet certainty of her words transformed the silence around them into something almost reverent, and she felt the Duke's presence beside her once more as though he had anticipated her choice before she herself had fully formed it. He extended his hand toward her with deliberate calm, not as a command but as an invitation that respected her freedom even within its confidence. "I will not presume upon your gratitude," he said softly enough that only those nearest could hear him clearly, "but I cannot remain silent regarding my intentions." Eliza looked at him then with a clarity that seemed to gather all the uncertainty of the previous days into a single moment of recognition, and she realized that the protection he had offered her had never been an act of impulse but of patience. "My intention," he continued, his voice steady though unmistakably personal, "is to ask whether you would consider allowing me the honor of your partnership, not because society requires explanation but because I believe our futures would be stronger together than apart." The words carried across the ballroom with quiet certainty, and for a moment even Lady Harcourt's practiced composure failed her as the magnitude of his declaration became unmistakable. Eliza felt the weight of the ring he had entrusted to her earlier resting against her palm, and she understood suddenly that its meaning had never depended upon obligation but upon choice. She stepped closer to him, aware that every eye followed the movement yet feeling no desire to retreat from the attention that once would have frightened her. "I was called unworthy before witnesses," she said softly, her voice steady enough to reach beyond the circle that surrounded them. "Yet you answered that judgment with respect before I had even asked for it." "You were never unworthy," he replied without hesitation. She placed her hand in his then, not with hesitation but with certainty that surprised even herself, and the quiet sound of approval that moved through the room carried none of the sharpness of gossip but something warmer and more enduring. "If you still wish it," she said, meeting his gaze with unmistakable trust, "I will accept your partnership." The Duke's expression changed not with triumph but with something far deeper and more private, and he inclined his head as though acknowledging not victory but gratitude. "It has always been my wish," he answered. Behind them the music resumed almost cautiously, as though uncertain whether such a moment belonged to celebration or reverence. Yet Eliza scarcely noticed the shifting attention of the guests because she had become aware of another presence near the edge of the circle. Her mother stood there with tears bright upon her cheeks, her expression transformed from anxious hope into unmistakable pride, and Eliza crossed the remaining distance between them before drawing her gently forward to stand beside her. "You see," she whispered softly, "we were not forgotten after all." Her mother pressed her hand tightly, unable to speak but no longer needing to. Across the ballroom Frederick turned away at last, his departure quiet enough to escape notice by most yet unmistakable to Eliza, who watched him leave not with bitterness but with a calm understanding that the life he had once represented no longer held any claim upon her future. The Duke followed her gaze only briefly before speaking again, his voice low enough to belong to her alone despite the crowd surrounding them. "There remains one place we must return before this chapter closes," he said. She understood immediately what he meant, though he had not spoken its name aloud. "The cathedral," she answered. He inclined his head once more, his expression softened by certainty rather than hesitation. "Yes," he said gently. "Where they believed your story ended." Eliza lifted her chin, no longer recalling the echo of whispers that had once followed her down its aisle but instead imagining the sound of her own footsteps returning there with dignity restored, and as she looked at him she felt the extraordinary calm of knowing that this time she would not walk alone.